Good afternoon or good morning, depending on the time that you are going to watch me. Again, my apologies for not being able to make the meeting. However, I hope that with this record and the PowerPoint presentation, you can really have a very good idea about my chapter that talks about Brazil's view of India as a diplomatic partner in world trade, particularly, of course, in the World Trade Organization, the multilateral system of trade. Let's see briefly what is strange about the partnership under a traditional interest-based account between two countries that form an alliance. And for that, let's compare briefly, before anything, Brazil's and India's stances and alliances throughout time in WTO, starting with Tokyo round in the 70s. As you know, at the time, the country was, both Brazil and India, were under an import substitution industrialization strategy. The world was very different. Both countries were leaders of the developing world, India with a more non-aligned stance, being an integral part of the non-aligned movement. However, both countries, they shared the same interest, that is, they had a defensive position against liberalization. Nonetheless, what is going on now, 30 years, more than 30 years afterwards? Now there is, rather than simply the GATT, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, there is the World Trade Organization, and both countries are big players in the organization. Nonetheless, India is far less willing to liberalize than Brazil, particularly agriculture. India still has very defensive interests, whereas Brazil has first and foremost defensive interest in liberalizing agricultural markets. Both countries, however, they are pretty much aligned in the process of liberalizing, or let's say dealing with the WTO. As the last Bali conference, ministerial conference in Bali, Indonesia, demonstrates. Both, okay, are emerging powers, so they can have mutual interests because of that. However, Brazil and India are not really the same sort of emerging powers. They really have interaction with the globalized world, but, well, again, in very different degrees and very different perceptions. So why such an alliance persists? If they have first those divergent interests, India is regarded as far more powerful than Brazil, given its geopolitical location, and an evidence of that is its strategic partnership with the United States. I think identity explains a lot, namely state identity. Identity that, as Kaltenstein and others would say, represents, frames the action of the country abroad. However, that identity is not stable. The current identity of Brazil is an emerging power, okay, and Brazil tends to see its interests through those lenses, even if those interests, material interests, the interests of its interest groups are not actually satisfied. And thanks for that, it tends to seek partnerships and keeps stable its partnership with India, regardless of any eventual grievances that both may have in terms of their immediate short-term interests. In order to build the argument, first I will review the literature on the topic, that is on the alliance between Brazil and India, and the WTO level, that is what concerns trade. Afterwards, however, I also mentioned very briefly their alliance in other spheres than trade, particularly in the process of trying to reform the United Nations Security Council. Then I briefly developed a theoretical framework to explain how identities can be reframed from time to time, and therefore helping to preserve alliances. Of course, have in mind the Brazilian case vis-a-vis India. The empirical assessment, based on interviews with diplomats in both countries and archival research, demonstrates that process, that is, the move from an identity as leaders of the developing world towards emerging powers, now in the 2000s, but with an interregnum in which identities were not stable at all, and in which they started to portray opposite interests in economic terms, and therefore the conclusion. So, as you know, both are members of the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, since the 40s, and although the cooperation really started in Tokyo round, or perhaps even before, but it became very clear in the Tokyo round, it was in the Uruguay round when first they really built up strength trying to block the entrance of services in the negotiations. But after, as liberalization was spread out in the world, they ended up in opposite sides, perhaps not opposite, depending on the literature that you talk about. Some people, including the diplomats themselves, would say that they took divergent paths, but not very opposite. Brazil started to side more with agricultural exporters, and India remained with stronger stances in resisting liberalization. And that, however, those positions persisted in the Doha development round that was launched in 2001. However, what it remains puzzling in the literature is that it's not so clear how they could build up forces again, perhaps because they are emerging powers, but okay, there's an identity thing ongoing there. However, how exactly that emerged, that is not clear. Their partnerships are evident, as I said before, in other international organizations, particularly the World, the United Nations, and it became clear as with the 2000s, they started to have a more assertive foreign policy, including building alliances with other sovereign countries, most notably South Africa, with which they formed the IPSA Forum. In terms of how to frame the question, I need a theory that helps me to link, or better said, I need a theoretical account that helps me to link the collapse of a given identity, moving towards the formation of new interests, and the crystallization of new identity that will help to frame those same interests in international negotiations. And I contend that we should look at the concept that is well developed for security studies, namely the idea of international practices. However, it has not been used so far for economic diplomacy, as far as I know. Pretty much, as they liberalize their economies, Brazil in particular, they perceive that it couldn't really rely much on the West, and therefore it led diplomats, including presidents, to look for partnerships with Southern countries. This is a better account than the idea that both are allies because of their peripheral position in the international society, because Brazil has a dubious Western identity, whereas India has a clear stance against a Western-centered and Western-dominated world. The picture that comes up in the following slide